Because in that gospel reading, we have the story of a man born blind whom Jesus healed. Now, people who are blind, especially those blind from birth, usually have a highly developed sense of touch. Their fingers become their eyes. In fact, if you have a blind person that is who's becoming your friend, they will want to reach out and touch your face. Now, we may find that kind of off-putting because that's encroaching on our personal space, our boundaries. But with the sense of touch, the blind is able to form a picture in their mind. Even though if they've been born blind from birth, they've never seen anything, they still form a picture in their mind. A blind person sees the world differently than a sighted person because they're not able to use their natural sight. And I don't know about you, but I am grateful for the gift of sight. Okay? We've become so accustomed to using the natural gift of sight that we can hardly imagine any other way of seeing. Our natural eyes give us clues about the world around us. However, our eyes do not give us all the information that we need. That's why we have the other four senses. But I don't talk about those this morning and replacing the eyes. I'm talking about the ability to see things beyond the natural order of things. Samuel had this handicap when he went to anoint the new king of Israel, who was to take Saul's place. It says in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Now, we do need to allow some grace and mercy for Samuel, because the last king he had anointed under the direction of the Lord was better looking and taller than any other Israelite around. But Saul was the one whom God had chosen at that time. We see that when it says in 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 2, Saul was a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people. And when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord told him, "Here is the man of whom I spoke to you. He it is who shall restrain my people." So Samuel obviously thought in this instance with Jesse that the tallest son of Jesse, Eliab, should be the next king. I mean, he was just going on his former experience. This is the way God had done it. This is what he wanted to happen. But you know, Moses had made the same mistake. One time he was told to strike the rock. The next time he was told to speak to the rock, but he struck it because that's what he had done before, and he got in trouble. It seems to me that what we could learn from this is that God doesn't follow a particular pattern. And in trying to establish patterns, we end up putting God in a box in the way he should do things. This was evident to me quite frequently in the areas that I used to travel, because we could take this morning's instance of healing and we would establish a pattern. If someone came to me who was blind, I would spit on the ground, make mud, stick it in their eyes, and tell them to go wash in Siloam if you can find it. But God doesn't work that way, because other times he just laid his hands on people. So we don't have a pattern. Samuel had used his natural sense of judgment based on his experience with God to discern whom God had chosen. And he found out he was mistaken. Now, we probably tend to do this with more regularity than we're probably aware of. In fact, I know someone who says that they choose a church based on whether the pastor preaches the Bible. Now, that sounds like a great concept, but this particular person has proven more than once that their knowledge of the Bible is very, very scant. So how will they know if the Bible is being preached? During the height of the charismatic movement, discernment was touted as a great gift, but it was in short supply. All a preacher needed at that time, I think I've said this before, but all a preacher needed at that time was a $60 haircut, fancy clothes, and be able to bear his pearly whites and say with a honey dripped, "Praise Jesus." And everybody believed he was the man of faith and power for the hour. No discernment was being exercised. It was all based on outward appearances, the natural sight. Now, Jesus warned about this very thing when he said in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 5, "For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray." Jesus was talking about the ones who come to us, point to Jesus, and say that he is the Christ, and yet lead people astray. When the prosperity gospel began to grow and great wealth was considered a sure sign of God's blessing, the problem with that thinking, though, at least for me, made the Catholics and the Mormons the ones most blessed of God because they're the two richest denominations on the earth. It wasn't a good criteria. Jesus warned us about this too, though we have failed to recognize the significance of his caution from Luke chapter 16, where he said, "For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God." So we need to understand that we can't use what we ordinarily go by in trying to discern things and figure things out and what we're supposed to do. We need, as the song says, to take it to the Lord in prayer. Now, there's a gift of the Spirit mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 called discernment, and it's for this purpose. It's listing the gifts that are given, and in verse 10 it says, "To another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another the ability to distinguish between spirits." Now, another reason the gift of discernment was and still is in short supply is that it was only used to locate and see demons. The gift has a much higher purpose than that. As we read in 1 John, in chapter 4 and verse 1, he says, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world." Now, I know at first glance it would appear that looking for demons or false prophets is what we should be doing. But that's not the case if you read it closely. We all know from our own experience and from observing others that if you're looking for what is wrong, you will find it, whether it's there or not. John tells us to use our judgment to look for God in those we listen to. "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but test the spirits whether they are from God." That's what you're looking for. If we will do that, if we have that intention guiding us to look for God, to look for the good, to look for the right, that's what we'll see. And that which is false, that which is bad, that which is evil will show up by contrast. Our five senses were given to us to help us navigate this plane and to enjoy what life has to offer. We come to depend on our senses so much that we take them for granted, and we fail to recognize when a different sense is called for. We need to also use our spiritual sense, which we don't too often exercise. And it's often, as in the case of Samuel, contrary to our natural senses. Jesus said in John chapter 7 and verse 24, "Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." Pretty much the same thing that God said to Samuel when he was assuming that Eliab was the new king. Jesus said to avoid using outward appearances as the criteria, especially in the realm of religious practices. And this is the context that's in John chapter 7. He had healed a man on the Sabbath, and the Jews were upset with him. Jesus pointed to their strict observance of the circumcision, which a male child born had to be circumcised on the 8th day after birth, regardless of which day of the week that fell on, which could be the Sabbath day. And Jesus pointed that out, that the circumcision was done regardless. Circumcision identified the wholeness of a male child as a Jew. Why should they be upset then if he had made a man completely whole on the Sabbath? The idea of religious rectitude has carried over into the religiosity of many Christians, even though Jesus and Paul both warned otherwise. Many people know that we can only come to God by faith, but then they use some outward criteria to decide how valid a person's faith or Christianity might be. Paul warned the early church against falling into this trap. In Romans chapter 14 and verse 1, he says, "As for the one who is weak in faith," can we say new in the faith, "welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions." Now, the context of opinions in Romans 14 is mainly about religious practices of eating and the Sabbath day. But he continues on into chapter 15 to indicate that any opinion is not worth arguing over. So I take that, because it doesn't say it in the Bible, I take that to also include our theological opinions. Our theology is based on what we know. And I'm pretty sure that everyone here is aware of the fact that we don't know what we don't know. To argue that someone is deceived because they believe something you don't is the height of arrogance, assuming you have the ear of God while the other doesn't. Now, this is just a little aside, but when I was preparing this sermon and writing it, when I wrote that paragraph, I said, wow, that's powerful. And so I posted it on Facebook. I said, to argue that someone is deceived because they believe something you don't is the height of arrogance, assuming you have the ear of God while the other doesn't. And I got a whole bunch of correction. I got a whole bunch of correction from the people who said, no, you got to point out sin, you got to point out this. Missed the point entirely. However, let's get back to what Paul says specifically in the realm of judging by outward appearances. He continues on in verse 2. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Verse 3, let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. I'm going to skip verse 4 for the moment and go to verse 5. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord, and the one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. Now, Paul makes a statement in the middle there in verse 4, which has guided my practice for decades. I've failed in it more often than I have succeeded, but I'm getting better at understanding verse 4 now that I have come to understand the expansive love of God. Paul writes it in a magnificent way in my mind. In verse 4, he says, who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. He's implying there that I am not your master. I'm not anybody's master, so who am I to judge another master's servant? This brothers and sisters, is the righteous judgment the Lord expects from us. When this becomes your level of faith, that is, that the Lord is able to make them stand, when that becomes your level of faith, you will give up judging and criticizing. You will begin to see differently than the majority, but with the eyes of Jesus and how He looks upon us. In my search of the Scriptures, I have never found a job, a title, an office, or any indication of a position called God's policeman. Haven't found it. There is no outside person who has the responsibility of enforcing any perceived rule in the kingdom of God. Now, I know people will argue with me on that because Paul said, husbands, love your wives. Wives, submit to your husbands, and all that sort of stuff. That's a whole separate teaching, but just very quickly, that was Paul saying it to them. That does not give the husband the right to say, woman, you must submit to me. That's not in there, but that's where we take it. Love and acceptance is to be the guiding factor in all that we say, think, or do, especially in our relation with others. So that brings up the question, are we going to see things of which we don't approve? Absolutely. Are we going to see people committing less than desirable or sinful acts? You betcha. Should we expose that weakness that we see from another? No. Should we call out the sinners among us? No. What then? We are to love them. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 8 says, above all, keep loving one another earnestly. Why? Because love covers a multitude of sins. It covers them, it hides them. That word is the half of the compound of apocalypse. The apocalypse in Revelation is the unveiling, and this is the veiling of sin. It hides it. Love hides sin. So I encourage you today to buy a supply of love covers. And whenever you see someone doing something that doesn't measure up to your standards, throw a love cover over them. Love one another earnestly. Amen.